wake up, you work, you come home, you repeat. And somewhere between the first cycle and the 1000th, you stopped asking whether this is what you actually want. You just accepted that this is how it works, that this is how it should be, that anything else would be irresponsible, or too risky, or simply impossible for someone like you. And the phrase, someone like you, was never questioned. You just know there's a limit, an invisible ceiling, a place where you belong. And that place doesn't include extraordinary wealth, doesn't include total freedom, doesn't include real power, because those things belong to other people, different people, people who aren't you. You never decided this consciously. You never sat down and thought, I'm going to accept mediocrity as my destiny. But somehow, you accepted it. And what's most disturbing is that you don't even notice you accepted it, because the acceptance didn't come as a decision. It came as a feeling, as a silent certainty, as something that was always there. And now you're here, living a life that doesn't feel wrong, just limited, just contained, just smaller than what you felt was possible when you didn't yet know there were rules. But the rules exist, and you follow them, without noticing you're following them, without noticing they were installed, without noticing that every time you choose safety instead of possibility, you're obeying something that isn't even yours. The average isn't an accident. It's not what's left over when you don't try hard enough. It's not the natural result of lack of talent or lack of opportunity. The average is a programmed destination, an arrival point that was decided before you even started walking. And what's most frightening is that the average is comfortable. It doesn't feel like a prison. It feels like prudence. It feels like realism. It feels like the place where sensible people should be. Because being average isn't failing. Being average is being normal. It's being accepted. It's being safe. You were taught that extremes are dangerous, that excessive ambition is arrogant, that wanting too much is a sign of imbalance, that people who pursue real wealth are compensating for something, that people who don't settle for enough are lost, that people who reject normality are taking unnecessary risks. And you believed it. Because everyone around you believed it. Because all the voices you respected repeated the same message. Because rejecting that message would mean rejecting everything that seemed safe, everything that seemed right, everything that seemed validated. So you adjusted. You accepted that there's a pattern, and that this pattern is where you should be. You accepted that people like you earn a certain amount, live a certain way, have access to certain things, and not to others. And this didn't seem unfair. It just seemed natural. But natural doesn't mean true. Natural just means repeated so many times it became invisible. Repeated so many times it became automatic. Repeated so many times it became you. And now you look at your life and see limits. Limits you didn't choose. Limits you can't explain. Limits that are just there, as if they'd always been there. As if they were part of reality. As if they were inevitable. But they're not inevitable. They're trained, and you were trained so well you don't even notice you were trained. You just think this is how things are, and maybe they are. For you. For now. You weren't born knowing where your place was. You weren't born understanding what was safe and what was dangerous. You weren't born with a predefined identity. You came without instructions, without limits, without fear of wanting too much. But that didn't last long. Because soon you started being shaped, not by force, not by violence, but by repetition, by reward, by silent punishment, by social validation, by subtle disapproval. You did something, and the people around you reacted. If the reaction was positive, you repeated it. If the reaction was negative, you avoided it. And gradually, you began to understand what was expected of you, what was acceptable, what was safe, what was dangerous. And you didn't need explanations. You just felt it. Felt it in the look. Felt it in the tone of voice. Felt it in the approval, or the absence of it. And you learned. Learned that some things generated connection, and others generated distance. Some things generated security, and others generated fear. So you adjusted. Because you depended on these people, because you needed their approval, because you had no choice, And with each adjustment, you internalized a pattern. With each adjustment, you built an identity. With each adjustment, you accepted a limit. And nobody told you this was happening. Nobody warned you that you were being conditioned, because the people who were conditioning you didn't know they were conditioning. They thought they were educating you, that they were protecting you, that they were preparing you for the world. But the world they knew was limited. It was average. It was conditioned. And what they did was prepare you to accept the same limits, to repeat the same patterns, to carry the same mediocrity they carried. Not because they wanted to harm you, but because it was all they knew. And you absorbed it. You internalized it. You normalized it. And now you're here, carrying programming that isn't yours, obeying rules you didn't create, living within limits that were installed before you had the capacity to question. And what's most frightening is that these limits don't feel external. They feel internal. They feel like part of who you are. They feel like truth. Because they were repeated so many times, they became you. Because they were validated by so many people, they became reality. Because they were accepted for so long, they became invisible. And now you can't separate what is you from what was placed in you. You can't separate what you want from what you were taught to want. You can't separate what's possible from what was programmed as impossible. So you continue. You repeat. You obey. And you call this being authentic, being realistic, being responsible. But what you're really doing is perpetuating a conditioning that was never yours. You learned that obeying generates security, that adjusting generates acceptance, that not standing out too much generates peace. And you were rewarded for it. Every time you behaved according to what was expected, you received approval. Every time you stayed in the right place, you received validation. Every time you accepted the average, you received comfort. And that seemed sufficient, because the reward was real, the approval was real, the comfort was real. So you continued obeying, you continued adjusting, you continued accepting, because it seemed like this was what sensible people did. But there were moments when you questioned, moments when you wanted more, moments when you imagined a different life, a bigger life, a life where you didn't have to settle. And in those moments, something happened. You were pulled back, not with force, not with aggression, but with concern, with care, with warnings disguised as protection. The people around you reminded you of the risks, reminded you that you could lose what you already had, reminded you that other people tried and failed, reminded you that being different is dangerous. And you listened, because these people seemed to be taking care of you, because they seemed to be protecting you, because they seemed to know more than you. And you returned. You returned to the safe place, to the known place, to the average place. And each time you returned, the pattern strengthened. Each time you returned, the limit solidified. Each time you returned, the average identity became more real, more you, more inevitable. And now you're trapped, not by chains, not by external force, but by a system of reward and punishment that was so well installed it became automatic. That became invisible. That became you. And every time you think about leaving, about risking, about trying something bigger, the system reacts. It generates discomfort. It generates fear. It generates guilt. And you obey. Because the discomfort feels like a warning. Because the fear feels like wisdom. Because the guilt feels like proof that you're leaving the right place. So you stay. You accept. You settle. And you call this maturity, growth, realism. But what you're really doing is obeying a conditioning that was designed to keep you exactly where you are, because the average needs you. The average needs you to stay. The average needs you to accept. And it will do everything to ensure you don't leave. Because if you leave, if you realize the limits aren't real, the entire system loses power. Imagine an aquarium large enough for the fish to swim, large enough for the fish not to feel trapped, but small enough that the fish never sees the ocean, never sees what's possible beyond the glass. The fish swims, the fish eats, the fish lives, and it never questions whether there's something bigger, because everything it knows is inside the aquarium. Everything it sees is contained. Everything it feels is limited. And this doesn't feel like a limitation. This feels like reality. Now imagine someone tries to remove the fish from the aquarium, tries to place it in the ocean. The fish resists. Because the ocean is unknown. Because the ocean is too big. Because the ocean doesn't have the walls the fish learned to recognize as security. So the fish returns. It chooses the aquarium. Not because the aquarium is better, but because the aquarium is known. Because the aquarium is predictable. Because the aquarium is where it learned it should be, and it never realizes it could swim farther, that it could explore more, that it could live differently. Because for it, the aquarium isn't a limitation. The aquarium is reality. It's all that exists. It's all that makes sense. You're in the aquarium, and the aquarium isn't made of glass. It's made of beliefs, of identity, of conditioning, and you learn to live inside it, learn to accept the walls, learn to call this prudence, realism, responsibility. But the walls aren't real. They just seem real. Because they were repeated so many times they became invisible. Because they were validated by so many people they became truth. Because they were accepted for so long they became you. And now you look at people who swim in the ocean. People who live beyond the walls. People who don't accept the aquarium as reality. And you assume they're different. That they have something you don't have. That they were born with capabilities you don't possess. But the truth is simpler and more disturbing. They just stopped obeying the walls. They just started acting as if the limit didn't exist. And the limit, realizing it had no real power, disappeared. But you don't act like that. Because for you, the limit is real. Because for you, leaving the aquarium is dangerous. Because for you, accepting the average is the only sensible option. And you defend this, you justify this, you believe this, not because it's true, but because you were trained to believe it. And the training was so effective you don't even notice you were trained. You just think, this is how you are. The average doesn't limit your effort. It limits your perception. It limits what you believe is possible, what you believe is appropriate, what you believe is yours. You look at an opportunity to earn more, to grow more, to risk more. And something inside you decides whether that opportunity is for you. And this decision isn't rational. It doesn't go through conscious analysis. It happens in milliseconds, as a sensation, as discomfort, as a silent certainty that this isn't your place. And you obey. Because the sensation feels like truth. Because the discomfort feels like wisdom. Because the certainty feels like protection. But what you're really doing is obeying a pattern that was installed to keep you where you are. A pattern that confuses safety with stagnation. The average also limits how much you believe you're worth. And this isn't about self-esteem. It's about the number you accept as fair. The number you ask for. The number you defend. Because your average identity has a ceiling that seems reasonable, a ceiling that seems appropriate for someone like you. And whenever you try to exceed that ceiling, something inside you resists. Something inside you says you're exaggerating, that you're being arrogant, that you're asking for more than you deserve. And you give in. Because the resistance feels like a warning. Because the discomfort feels like truth. But the discomfort isn't truth. The discomfort is just the signal that you're violating the conditioning, that you're leaving the pattern, that you're challenging the identity that was installed to keep you average. And your average identity will do everything to bring you back. Because it wasn't programmed to make you wealthy. It was programmed to keep you safe. And safety, in its system, means staying where you are, means accepting what seems appropriate, means not causing discomfort, means remaining average. The average also limits how much risk you tolerate. And risk here isn't just financial, it's emotional, it's social, it's about identity itself. Because every time you try to leave the average, you're risking losing the validation of people who know you as you are now. You're risking being seen differently. You're risking no longer belonging. And that risk seems larger than any reward. Because your average identity values belonging above expansion. It values acceptance above growth. It values comfort above possibility. So you pull back, you adjust, you return to the equilibrium point. And you call this being responsible, being mature, being realistic. But what you're really doing is obeying a limit that was never real. That was just installed, just trained, just normalized. And now it controls everything. It controls how much you earn, how much you risk, how much you want, how much you believe is possible. And you don't notice. Because the limit doesn't speak, it doesn't argue, it just acts, it just decides, it just keeps you exactly where the average expects you to be. Most people never question the average, because questioning the average feels arrogant, feels ungrateful, feels dangerous, because the average is defended as virtue, as humility, as realism. And everyone around you reinforces this. Everyone around you validates this, because everyone around you is operating from the same programming. They have their own aquariums, their own average identities, their own internal limits. And when you try to leave, when you try to question, when you try to act differently, they react. They pull you back. Not because they want to harm you, but because you leaving threatens their aquarium. Because if you can leave, then they can too. And that's uncomfortable. That's dangerous. That requires them to question everything they believe to be true about themselves. So they convince you that you're wrong, that you're risking too much, that you're changing in negative ways, that you're becoming someone you're not, and you believe them, because they seem to be protecting you, because they seem to be bringing you back to reality. But what they're really doing is bringing you back to the average, back to the conditioning, back to the pattern that keeps everyone in the same place. And they do this with care, with concern, with love, because they truly believe they're helping you, because they truly believe the average is the right place. And you accept, because accepting is easier, because accepting generates approval, because accepting keeps you connected. So you return, you adjust, you abandon the questioning, and you call this maturity, wisdom, humility. But what you're really doing is obeying a collective system of limitation, a system that needs you to stay average, a system that rewards conformity and punishes difference, a system that was installed in you before you had the capacity to refuse. And questioning this system feels impossible. Because questioning means admitting you were conditioned, that you're not who you think you are, that everything you believe about yourself might just be an installed pattern. And that's terrifying. Because if you're not who you think you are, then who are you? So most don't question. Most accept. Most continue operating from the same average identity, from the same aquarium, from the same limit. And they call this being authentic, being realistic, being true to themselves. But they're not being authentic. They're being obedient. They're not being realistic. They're being limited. They're not being true to themselves. They're being true to the conditioning. And the most disturbing part is they'll never realize it. Because to realize it, they would have to look inward. They would have to question. They would have to accept that everything they believe might be false. And that's a risk the average identity will never allow them to take. So they stay, they repeat, they obey. And they never realize the aquarium was open the whole time. That the walls were never real. That the average identity controlling their life was never theirs. You've made it this far. And now something inside you is different. Not necessarily better. Just different. Because you can't pretend you didn't notice anymore. You noticed there's a pattern operating. You noticed it was installed. You noticed it's limiting. And you noticed it's not you. But noticing doesn't change anything. Because the average identity doesn't care what you notice. It cares what you do. And it's already preparing to bring you back. It will convince you this was just content. That this was just theory, that this doesn't apply to your reality. It will remind you of all the reasons why you are where you are. It will show you all the risks of trying to leave. It will make you feel that questioning is dangerous, and you'll obey. Because obeying is easier. Because obeying is safer. Because obeying is what you've always done. And in a few days, you'll be back to the pattern, back to the limit, back to the average, and you'll call this returning to reality. Being responsible, stopping the fantasy. But what you're really doing is returning to the conditioning, and the conditioning will be grateful because it needs you to return, Because without you obeying, it doesn't exist. But there's a part of you that won't forget, a part that will keep observing, a part that will start noticing the moments when you pull back, the moments when you accept less than you could, the moments when you choose the average because the average feels safe. And that part will whisper. It will remind you that you noticed, that you saw, that you understood. And you'll have to decide, not now, but at some point, you'll have to decide whether you keep obeying a conditioning that isn't yours, or whether you start questioning, whether you start challenging, whether you start acting as if the limit isn't real. And that decision won't be easy, because the average identity will fight. It will generate discomfort. It will generate fear. It will generate guilt. And you'll have to choose whether it's worth it, whether the possibility is greater than the safety, whether leaving the average is more important than staying where everyone expects you to stay. And maybe you'll choose to stay. Maybe you'll decide the average is comfortable enough, that the limit is acceptable, that the identity, even though it's not yours, is easier to carry than the uncertainty of building a new one. And there's no judgment in that, because most choose to stay, most choose to obey, most choose the safety of the average. But now you know it's a choice. And that changes everything. Because before, you thought you had no option. You thought you were trapped. You thought the limit was real. But now you know the limit is just a conditioning. And conditionings can be perceived, can be questioned, can be challenged, but only if you decide it's worth it. Only if you decide that your life, your income, your identity, are worth more than the comfort of remaining average. Only if you decide that you are more than the pattern that was installed in you. And the truth is, you already know the answer. You already know whether you're going to act or whether you're going to return. You already know whether you're going to question or whether you're going to obey. You already know, because the average identity has already decided for you, and now it's watching, it's waiting, it's ready to bring you back to the safe place, to the known place, to the average place. And the only question that remains is, will you notice when it happens?